What would you do if you realized the coffin lowering into the ground wasn't new? If the scratches on its surface were already there from another burial, another body? And what if the man guiding the ropes, the Undertaker himself, smiled as if he knew you'd noticed? It was February of 1907, and the little Pennsylvania town of Ashmoor lay beneath a quilt of mist and melting snow. Reverend Thomas Crane, recently arrived from Philadelphia to serve at St. Matthew's Church, was still learning the quiet rhythm of funerals, weddings, and whispered confessions that filled the days here. That morning, the air felt different, denser somehow, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath. The funeral was for Mrs. Abigail Holbrook, the mayor's late wife, a woman beloved by nearly everyone in town. The church bells tolled their slow, measured lament as the coffin was wheeled toward the open grave. Thomas, standing beside the pastor, tried to focus on the scripture he was meant to read, but his gaze kept drifting toward the coffin. It was a handsome piece of work, mahogany polished to a muted sheen, lined with soft gray velvet, the sort of coffin reserved for wealthy families. But as the pallbearers adjusted the ropes, a small detail caught his eye: a set of thin, curved scratches near the brass handle. He had seen those same marks before, only 2 weeks earlier during the burial of a poor seamstress named Lydia Knox. He'd noticed identical scars along the lid of her plain pine coffin, except this one, though painted darker and trimmed with silver, bore the same strange pattern. For a moment, Thomas thought it was his imagination. But when the coffin tilted slightly over the grave, sunlight caught on the wood, and he saw the faint outline of a cross-shaped gouge, crudely sanded over. His stomach turned. The Undertaker, Mr. Elias Graver, stood a few feet away, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his shoulders. He was a tall man past 50, with iron-gray hair and eyes the color of wet ash. Everyone in Ashmoor respected him. Graver handled death with a kind of solemn grace, never a mistake, never a scandal. But when his gaze met Thomas's across the gravesite, something flickered there. Not grief, not reverence, something like amusement. After the service, townspeople drifted away through the fog. Only the reverend, the sexton, and the Undertaker remained. Graver wiped his hands on a black handkerchief and nodded politely. "A fine service, Reverend Crane. The Holbrooks will be pleased." Thomas forced a thin smile. It was dignified, as it should be. "Indeed," Graver said, his voice smooth as oil. "Every soul deserves dignity, no matter how many times they've been laid to rest." For a heartbeat, Thomas thought he'd misheard. But before he could respond, Graver tipped his hat and walked toward his small wooden shack at the far edge of the cemetery, where the fog swallowed him whole. Thomas remained by the grave, staring at the freshly turned soil. The world seemed too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the slow drip of thawing snow from the iron gate. He bent to trace the wooden edge of the burial platform, his gloved fingers brushing a thin thread of red velvet caught on the metal latch, the same fabric he'd seen in the seamstress's coffin. That night, as the church bells marked 10 o'clock, Reverend Crane sat alone in his quarters above the chapel, staring at the fire. The scratches, the velvet, the Undertaker's words, none of it would leave his mind. Outside, the fog thickened until even the lamplight on the street below looked drowned. Somewhere beyond the graveyard walls, a wooden door creaked open, and a lantern flared to life. Someone, perhaps Elias Graver, was still working among the dead, and Reverend Crane suddenly knew. He would not sleep until he learned what was truly buried beneath Ashmoor. Have you ever stepped into a place so still that even your heartbeat felt like an intrusion? Where the air itself seemed to whisper, "You shouldn't be here?" 2 days after the Holbrook funeral, Reverend Thomas Crane returned to the cemetery. The morning was heavy with mist again, the kind that clung to your skin and muffled the sound of your own footsteps. He told himself he came to pray over the new grave, yet deep down he knew that wasn't true. He was there for Elias Graver's shack. The small structure stood apart from the rest of the grounds, half hidden behind a line of crooked oaks. Its single window reflected no light, only a dull gray sheen. Thomas hesitated at the door, feeling like a trespasser at the edge of something sacred or profane. He knocked once. No answer. The handle was cold metal, turned easily. Inside, the air was thick and wrong. A sharp chemical tang bit at his nostrils, formalin though he barely knew the name. Underneath it lingered the sour-sweet rot of wilted flowers and something heavier, animal. A kerosene lamp sat on a workbench beside a half-empty teacup. Tools were arranged with a soldier's precision. Bone saws, chisels, brushes, a tin bowl stained brown. On the floor, dark streaks that might have been old varnish or blood. But what drew his eye most was a black leather ledger lying open on the table. Thomas's gloved hand trembled as he turned the first page. Each line was neat and deliberate. Name, date, amount. John P. Calloway, June 1906, full service. Lydia Knox, January 1907, casket only. Abigail Holbrook, February 1907, full service. The ink was fresh. He flipped forward and froze. Some names appeared twice months apart with different causes of death. A miner named Walter Finch was listed as lung collapse in August, then again in November for accidental drowning. Beside a few entries, Graver had written strange notes. Body returned. Repaint. Replace lining. Thomas's breath caught. Repaint? Replace lining? The same coffin reused, perhaps the same body. He felt cold spread down his spine like a slow trickle of ice. He turned another page. At the bottom, written in red ink, delay payment from Holbrook estate. Substitute for Cooper family. Before he could think, the floor creaked behind him. Thomas spun around. The Undertaker stood in the doorway, his gray coat still damp from the fog, a small bundle of twine in his gloved hands. Looking for something, Reverend? Graver's voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was no warmth in it. His pale eyes glinted like frost over a grave. I knocked. You weren't here, Thomas stammered, closing the ledger halfway. I wanted to speak about the Holbrook burial. There's been talk in town. Talk? Graver took a slow step forward. Gossip then. There's always gossip around the dead. People love to imagine horrors beneath the soil. He smiled faintly. But the truth, Reverend, is always much simpler. Thomas forced a nervous chuckle. Of course, I meant no offense. None taken. Graver laid the bundle of twine on the table, his hand resting beside the ledger. Still, one must be careful. The dead dislike being disturbed, and so sometimes do the living. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, Thomas thought the Undertaker might grab him, or worse. But instead, Graver stepped aside and gestured toward the door. The air's not good in here. Too many chemicals. You should wait at the chapel if you need me. Thomas nodded quickly, his throat dry, and stepped outside. As he walked away, he felt the man's gaze burning between his shoulder blades until the fog swallowed him. At the cemetery gates, Thomas realized he was still holding something. A tiny scrap of paper torn from the ledger, stuck to his glove. On it, written in the same precise handwriting, were two words: returned bodies. That night, no prayer eased his mind. The image of the ledger haunted him, the repetition of names, the red ink, the Undertaker's calm threat. And though he tried to convince himself that curiosity had gone too far, Thomas knew the truth. He had opened the first page of a story the earth itself had tried to bury. Have you ever read a name of the dead? Twice? The same handwriting, the same date of birth, but two different deaths. And what if the man who buried them both was still doing business with their bodies? The next morning, Reverend Thomas Crane could not bring himself to open the Bible. The words blurred before his eyes. His thoughts were elsewhere, back in that reeking shack on those neatly written names. The fog outside had frozen overnight, leaving a thin crust of ice on the churchyard gate. Each creak of metal sounded like bones snapping. Ashmoor was still and pale under the weak winter sun, but Thomas felt a restless pulse beneath the snow, as though the ground itself was hiding something alive. He wrapped his scarf tighter and headed toward Town Hall, a squat brick building on Main Street that smelled of ink and damp paper. Inside, an elderly clerk looked up from a pile of records, his spectacles trembling on his nose. "Morning, Reverend Crane," the man greeted, surprised. "You're far from your pulpit today." "I'm reviewing some parish records," Thomas lied quickly. "I'd like to cross-check a few recent burials." "Mr. Elias Graver handled most of them, I believe?" At the mention of that name, the clerk's eyes flickered, then softened with polite indifference. "Graver? Oh yes, reliable man, very thorough. The city's been lucky to have him. You'll find all burial certificates by year shelves to your right." Thomas nodded and began leafing through the heavy ledgers. The paper crackled softly, releasing a faint smell of dust and mildew. Line after line of neat cursive writing. Name, date, cause of death, Undertaker. He started with the most recent month and worked backward. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Then, halfway through the 1906 register, his breath caught. Walter Finch, August 4th, 1906. Cause: lung collapse. Undertaker E. Graver. 2 pages later, Walter Finch, November 29th, 1906. Cause: accidental drowning. Undertaker E. Graver. The same man, the same age, the same address. Thomas flipped to another entry. Martha Doyle, May 1905, fever. Martha Doyle, September 1907, childbirth complications. Impossible, unless the town of Ashmoor had 24 ghosts walking its muddy streets. He sat back, heart hammering. Someone had been reusing names of the dead or the dead themselves. He turned to older books. The pattern repeated: duplicate deaths, altered causes, reissued burial certificates. And always, in the Undertaker column, that same elegant script, E. Graver. A realization crept over him, cold and nauseating. These were not clerical errors. These were transactions. For several minutes, Thomas simply stared at the pages. The ink shimmered faintly in the lamplight, as if alive. The thought came unbidden: maybe they are. The clerk shuffled over, curious. "Something the matter, Reverend?" Thomas quickly closed the ledger. "Just inconsistencies. Perhaps poor record-keeping." "Ah, yes," the man chuckled dryly. "Happens when it's the same Undertaker handling most of the town. Graver's been doing it nearly 15 years now. Half the graveyard might as well belong to him." Half the graveyard. The words hit harder than the man intended. When Thomas stepped back into the street, the snow had begun to fall again. Soft flakes that seemed to muffle the world. He could hear only the slow toll of the church bell in the distance, and the faint hum of a wagon rolling over the frozen road. He walked without direction until he found himself staring through the iron fence at the cemetery. From here, Graver's shack looked like a dark blot at the edge of white earth. Smoke rose lazily from its chimney, curling against the gray sky. He imagined the Undertaker inside, polishing the same coffins, writing the same names over and over, building his quiet empire of silence. A question clawed at his thoughts, one he wished he could silence. Was Elias Graver selling the dead? That night, Thomas sat at his desk, the ledger's image burned behind his eyelids. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering the town like a shroud. Somewhere beneath it, faint and rhythmic, he thought he heard the slow scrape of a shovel. Or perhaps it was only the echo of his own heartbeat, deep beneath the snow. What would you do if someone told you the dead don't always stay buried? That the coffins you pray over might be emptied by nightfall? And that the Undertaker doesn't just bury the dead, he rents them out? By the end of that week, Reverend Thomas Crane could no longer carry the weight of silence. The ledgers, the repeating names, the strange calm of Elias Graver, all of it formed a knot in his chest that no prayer could loosen. Someone in town must have known what was happening long before he arrived. Someone who had worked beside Graver, perhaps even helped him. That someone was old Samuel Briggs, the cemetery's former caretaker. Thomas had heard the name whispered by parishioners. Mad old Briggs, they called him. A drunk who spoke to ghosts and lived out near the marsh road, where the fog never lifted. Graver had replaced him years ago. It took Thomas nearly an hour to reach the edge of town, following a dirt path lined with dead reeds. The air grew colder, carrying the distant croak of crows. At last he saw the crooked outline of a small wooden shack leaning against the wind. When he knocked, nothing happened. He tried again. Finally, a latch lifted, and an eye, pale and sharp as a nailhead, appeared through the crack. "Who's the skin?" "Reverend Crane. I serve at St. Matthew's. I need to speak with you about the cemetery." A long pause, then the door creaked open. The old man stood hunched in the doorway, wrapped in a patched coat, his beard yellowed with age and tobacco. Inside, the room smelled of wax, smoke, and old earth. A single candle flickered on a crate, throwing long shadows across walls covered in faded newspaper clippings and small wooden crosses. "You shouldn't have come," Samuel muttered. "If Graver learns you were here, you'll be the next one in his book." "I only want to understand," Thomas said quietly. "There are irregularities in the records. People buried twice. Bodies that seem to vanish. You worked there once, didn't you?" Briggs stared at him for a long time, his eyes reflecting the candle's flame. Then he sighed. I worked that ground 15 years. Knew every stone, every root, until Graver came." "What happened?" The old man laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "He came as a helper, polite, quiet, always with those damned gloves. Said he wanted to learn the trade. But there was something wrong in him from the start. Too much interest in what happens after the burial." He poured himself a swallow of whiskey from a cracked bottle, then leaned closer. "First, it was small things. Coffins looking used when they shouldn't be, the same fancy casket showing up twice. Thought I was losing my mind. Then one night, I caught him digging." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Digging up graves?" Briggs nodded slowly. "Worked like a man possessed. Opened the coffin, took out the body, wrapped it up like furniture, and hauled it to that shed of his. Next morning, the coffin was back in the ground, clean and empty. Took me weeks to realize what he was doing." "What was he doing?" "He was renting the dead, Reverend. Selling their bodies for funerals that never happened to folks who needed a corpse, to fake a death, claim an inheritance, hide a crime. Sometimes he'd switch names, sometimes just reuse the same coffin. Said it was a business that never ran dry. The dead don't complain, he'd tell me." Thomas shivered. "And no one suspected? Who'd believe an old drunk like me?" Briggs spat. "Besides, Graver made sure the right people stayed quiet. paid a few policemen, a few councilmen, had half the town in his pocket. When I tried to warn the priest before you, he called me mad and threw me out. So I left, and Graver kept on digging. The candle sputtered. For a moment, only the sound of the wind pressed against the walls. Thomas's voice came low, trembling. Why tell me this now? Samuel fixed him with a weary gaze. Because you've already gone too far. I can see it in your eyes. You've been inside his shack, haven't you? Thomas hesitated, then nodded. The old man exhaled, almost a whisper. Then you're marked. Once you read his book, he never forgets your name. He says every page in that ledger's a contract. Between him and the ones he buries. The candle's flame bent sideways, flickering as if stirred by an unseen breath. Samuel's voice sank to a rasp. He told me once, even the dead can earn their keep, Sam. You just have to know how to wake him. Thomas stared at the trembling flame, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it a faint, hollow sound, like shovels scraping frozen ground. Have you ever stood by a grave and felt that the person inside didn't belong there? That the face in the coffin was only wearing death like a mask? The next funeral came sooner than expected. A man named Mr. Ellison, a supposed merchant who had passed suddenly in his boarding house. No one in town seemed to know him. No shopkeepers, no church records, not even the post office. Yet somehow there were mourners, half a dozen strangers in black coats and veils. The service was held under a bruised gray sky, the earth soft from thawing snow. The coffin gleamed dark cherry red, its silver handles polished to a mirror. It was too fine, too expensive for a man with no history. Reverend Thomas Crane led the prayers, his voice trembling only slightly as he recited the familiar words. But when the coffin lid was lifted for the final farewell, his heart froze. The corpse's face looked painted, the lips faintly tinted, the cheeks brushed with rouge. The skin was wax smooth, the hair too neatly combed. It was not the stillness of death that unsettled him, but the sense of performance. Whoever this man had been, he had been prepared like a mannequin for display. Thomas glanced toward Elias Graver, standing with folded hands near the hearse. The Undertaker's eyes were calm, distant, almost proud. After the last hymn, as the crowd drifted away, Thomas lingered at a distance. Through the fog he saw one of the veiled mourners, a tall man in a fine coat, hand Graver a sealed envelope. The Undertaker nodded once, slipped it into his pocket, and turned toward his shack. That night, the church bell struck midnight, and Thomas was already climbing the hill toward the cemetery. The snow crackled under his boots. His lantern cast a trembling circle of light across crooked headstones. When he reached the new grave, the ground was no longer smooth. Fresh soil lay in uneven mounds, a shovel jutting from the dirt. He doused his lantern, heart pounding. Then came the sound, a slow, rhythmic scrape of metal on wood. He crept closer, crouching behind a marble angel. Through the veil of mist, he saw Graver himself, working silently. The coffin lid rose open with a groan. What Thomas saw inside turned his stomach to ice. The painted man was gone. In his place lay an empty lining, the silk wrinkled, stained with something dark. Graver reached in with steady hands, lifted the suit, and folded it neatly over his arm like a tailor collecting laundry. Then he whispered, almost tenderly, "You've served well enough, my friend. Time to make room for another." Thomas stumbled back, choking on his breath. The Undertaker's lantern turned, casting light across the graves, and for one terrible instant, Graver's pale face broke into a knowing smile. Thomas ran. But as he fled through the snow, the wind carried a sound behind him. A faint thud, as if a coffin lid was closing. Have you ever felt the air thicken before horror reveals itself? When silence itself becomes a warning, and even your heartbeat feels too loud. The night after the merchant's funeral, Reverend Thomas Crane returned to the cemetery, unable to sleep, unable to pray. The fog was thick enough to taste, cold, metallic, and wet. The only light came from the moon, half buried in clouds. He moved carefully between the gravestones, every step muffled by snow. Ahead, at the far end of the grounds, stood the small wooden shack. A dull orange glow pulsed from within, the kind of light that spoke of life among the dead. Thomas crouched behind a headstone, breath forming clouds in the air. He waited. A faint sound reached him, the squeak of hinges, the clink of glass. He edged closer until he could peer through the narrow window. What he saw inside stole his breath. Tables lined the walls, each holding a body, some freshly dead, others gray and waxy, their faces painted and dressed in fine clothes. Glass jars filled with pale liquid gleamed beside them. Tools hung in precise order. Scalpels, brushes, small wooden blocks. On one table, Elias Graver worked methodically, dabbing rouge on a corpse's cheeks, adjusting its suit, combing its hair. The Undertaker hummed softly, a hymn twisted out of tune. Then, as if sensing eyes upon him, he stopped. Thomas ducked, heart hammering. The shack's door creaked open. Footsteps crunched outside, slow, deliberate. Graver's voice drifted into the night. "I know you're out there, Reverend." Thomas didn't breathe. A lantern flared, sweeping across the graves. Its light grazed the marble angel where Thomas hid. He moved, crawling through the snow, trying to stay silent. The lantern beam flickered past again, closer this time. Then came a whisper, right behind him. "Curiosity is a sin, Reverend." A blow struck his head. The world spun into darkness. When Thomas awoke, there was no air. The world pressed in on him from every side. His arms were pinned. His knees touched wood. The smell was thick, varnish, velvet, earth. He tried to move, but something brushed against his face. The silk lining of a coffin lid inches above him. Panic ignited. He pushed, screamed, but his voice died in the suffocating dark. He could hear muffled sounds beyond the wood, the creak of steps, a faint humming. He beat at the lid until his hands bled. The coffin didn't move. Sweat chilled on his skin. Then, faintly, a sound, dirt falling. A shovelful, then another. Thomas's lungs burned. He clawed at the wood, whispering prayers that tangled into sobs. Somewhere above, Graver's calm voice drifted through the muffled dark. "Rest now, Reverend. You'll make a fine service tomorrow." The world grew heavier, quieter, until there was only the rhythm of his heartbeat, slow, desperate, fading beneath the soil. Have you ever felt the air thicken before horror reveals itself? When silence itself becomes a warning and even your heartbeat feels too loud? The night after the merchant's funeral, Reverend Thomas Crane returned to the cemetery, sleepless and shaking. Fog lay like wet wool over the stones. At the far edge of the grounds, a single window glowed, Graver's shack. He crept closer, boots sinking into thawed earth. Through a slit in the boards, he saw it all. Tables lined with bodies, some freshly dead, some gray and waxen, their faces painted, lips tinted, hair neatly combed. Bottles of formalin glimmered beside surgical tools arranged with a surgeon's care. And there was Elias Graver, sleeves rolled, humming a hymn as he brushed rouge onto a corpse's cheeks, adjusting its suit, polishing the nails. Thomas's stomach turned. Graver paused mid-stroke, head lifting slightly, as though the air itself had whispered. The Reverend ducked, heart hammering. The door creaked open. Snow crunched. "I know you're there, Reverend," the Undertaker called softly. Thomas crawled between the graves, lantern light sweeping just behind him. A voice came, close enough to feel the breath. "Curiosity is a sin," a blunt crack of pain, then blackness. He woke to darkness that pressed back. No light, no room to move. His elbows hit wood, his knees drawn tight. The air smelled of varnish and velvet. He slid his fingers upward and met a padded lid inches above his face. Coffin. Terror surged. He shoved, screamed, but sound went nowhere. The walls swallowed it. Something brushed his cheek, loose soil sifting through the seams. He beat at the lid until his nails split. Above him came the faint scrape of a shovel, the soft fall of dirt. Then Graver's calm, muffled voice. "Rest easy, Reverend Crane. You'll serve beautifully tomorrow." The shoveling slowed, stopped. Earth settled heavy on the wood. The dark thickened until even his heartbeat seemed to echo back from it. Steady, hopeless, the sound of a man being buried alive. Have you ever clawed your way out of your own grave? Felt splinters in your palms and soil in your lungs, fighting to prove you're still alive? Reverend Thomas Crane awoke to silence and pain. His throat burned, his wrists raw. For a moment he thought he was dead. Then his fingers brushed the nail that jutted through the coffin wall. He twisted his hands against it, sawing at the rope until the fibers gave. Blood slicked his palms, but at last the bindings fell away. He shoved upward with all his strength. The lid creaked, then cracked. Cold air rushed in, tainted with the stench of chemicals. Not underground. He was still in the shack. Graver had sealed him inside a coffin, waiting for dawn. Thomas staggered out, gasping, knees trembling. The lamp on the work table burned low. Around him lay rows of still faces, the same painted dead he'd seen before. On a shelf above them rested a thick black leather ledger, its cover smeared with fingerprints. He opened it. Every page was filled edge to edge in Graver's fine, mechanical script. Names, dates, causes of death, sums of money. Next to several entries were notes in red ink. Returned, repainted, ready. At the bottom of one page, Crane, pending. His stomach lurched. He seized the book and stumbled toward the door. The lock gave with a twist of his shoulder, and he fled into the snow, the night wind cutting his face like knives. By the time he reached the police station, his boots were soaked, his breath ragged. The desk sergeant looked up in disbelief. "Reverend? Good Lord, what happened to you?" "I've been buried alive," Thomas rasped. "You have to listen. This Graver, the Undertaker, he's using the dead, selling them. Look." He slammed the ledger onto the desk. The sergeant frowned, flipping it open. As he read, his expression shifted from irritation to horror. "These names. Some of these are councilmen, even officers. Then he owns this town," Thomas whispered. "But now you have proof." Within minutes, bells rang through the building. The sergeant fetched Captain Alden Hart, a broad-shouldered man with a soldier's posture and eyes that missed nothing. Hart read several pages in silence, jaw tightening. "Get the men," he said finally. "We ride now." Thomas clutched the ledger to his chest as the captain loaded his revolver. Outside, the fog rolled thick across the sleeping town. Somewhere beyond it waited the graveyard, and the man who made his living from the dead. The night of reckoning had begun. Have you ever seen evil die and still felt it breathing behind you? Some men leave graves when they go. Others become them. The clock struck 3 as Captain Alden Hart led his men through the fog-choked cemetery. Their lanterns cut narrow tunnels of gold through the mist. Beside him walked Reverend Thomas Crane, clutching the black ledger like a weapon made of truth. "Keep quiet," Hart ordered. "He'll hear us before we see him." The shack came into view, its window burning with a sickly orange glow. The air reeked of formalin and smoke. The captain raised his hand, and 6 rifles leveled toward the door. "Now!" The lock splintered under a boot. Lantern light spilled inside, and what they saw froze the men where they stood. Tables lined the room, each bearing a corpse in progress. Some were dressed in finery, others half covered by shrouds. The walls dripped with condensation and something darker. Shelves sagged beneath bottles labeled in Graver's precise handwriting. Preservative mixture, pigment number 3, tissue glue. At the center stood Elias Graver, his gloves soaked red, a scalpel gleaming in his hand. He looked up, unstartled. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "you're late. I was just finishing a client." "Drop it, Graver," Captain Hart barked. "It's over." Graver smiled, a thin, knowing curve of the lips. "Over? No, Captain. Death is never over." He reached into his coat. The men shouted, guns cocked. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small vial of cloudy liquid. "Stop!" Thomas cried, stepping forward. "You don't have to." But Graver had already uncorked it. The vial shattered between his teeth. He swallowed once, eyes gleaming. "I don't die," he whispered hoarsely. "I simply change bodies." A tremor rippled through him. His knees buckled, the scalpel clattering to the floor. Within seconds, his face turned ashen, the veins darkening like spreading ink. He fell forward across the table, lifeless. The silence that followed was unbearable. Captain Hart holstered his gun. "Get the others. Round up his clients. Every name in that ledger." By dawn, half the town's elite were under arrest. Merchants, officers, councilmen, each denying, trembling, or praying. The shack was doused in kerosene, its windows shattered. Thomas stood beside Hart as the captain struck a match. "Let it burn," he said. Flames roared to life, painting the gravestones gold and red. The stench of chemicals and death rose into the gray morning sky. When it was over, only ash remained, and the faint metallic glint of coffin nails buried in the soot. Ashmoor hailed Reverend Crane as a hero. The church bells rang for him, not for the dead. Yet each night, as he knelt to pray, he heard a whisper beneath the wind. "I don't die. I simply change bodies." And Thomas knew that the last burial had not yet come. Have you ever heard something calling from beneath the earth? A sound too deliberate to be wind, too steady to be imagination. As if someone buried long ago were knocking, asking to be let out. A year had passed since the burning of the shack. The townspeople of Ashmoor spoke of it only in whispers, as though the smoke still hung in their throats. The graveyard was quiet again, or seemed to be. Reverend Thomas Crane, now pastor of St. Matthew's, tried to bury the past under sermons and prayer. Yet every time he crossed the cemetery, he felt it breathing behind him. The patch of earth where they'd buried Elias Graver never settled flat. Even the grass refused to grow there, as if the soil itself rejected the man. Then, in February, the new caretaker came to Thomas's door, white as chalk. "They're gone, Reverend." 3 graves opened from the inside. Thomas followed him through the snow, lantern in hand. The moon glared coldly on the disturbed ground. Coffins lay cracked, empty, their lids pushed upward like someone had clawed their way out. "Grave robbers," Thomas whispered. The caretaker shook his head. "No footprints. And listen." They fell silent. From somewhere deep below came a faint knocking, slow, measured, unmistakable. Thomas's blood turned to ice. Where? The man pointed toward the far corner, to the mound that held Graver's grave. For weeks, the town buzzed with unease. People swore they'd seen a lantern flicker among the tombstones at night. A few claimed a figure moved there, a tall shape in a long coat, dragging a shovel behind it. Horses shied near the gates. Children refused to walk the road after sunset. Then came the rumors. Whispers of a group calling themselves the Resurrection Society. They met in cellars, it was said, studying the old Undertaker's methods. A doctor, a mortician, a wealthy widow. They believed Graver had discovered the secret of reversing death, of lending the flesh a second purpose. Thomas dismissed it all as hysteria, yet doubt gnawed at him. One night, after evening mass, he walked alone to the graveyard, unable to resist the pull. The fog parted just enough for him to see it, a shadow with a lantern, gliding between the stones. "Who's there?" he called. The light paused, then turned toward him. For an instant, Thomas saw a face, gray, hollow, and smiling. Then the lantern winked out. Only the echo of a voice remained, drifting through the cold air like a sigh. "Not dead, Reverend. Never dead." Thomas dropped to his knees in the snow, clutching his cross, but the graveyard had already gone silent again. Too silent, as if listening. Have you ever met someone whose face felt like a memory, as if the dead had borrowed new skin just to look at you again? It was the spring of 1918, 11 years after the burning of the shack. Ashmoor had changed. The war raged overseas, and death had become a business again. Coffins were ordered by the dozen, graves dug in rows. Reverend Thomas Crane, older now and weary, spent his days blessing the fallen and his nights trying not to dream of the man who once called death profitable. One gray afternoon, a knock sounded at the rectory door. Thomas opened it and froze. On the threshold stood a young man, tall and composed, dressed in a dark wool coat despite the warmth. His features were disturbingly familiar, the same high cheekbones, the same pale eyes that seemed to see too much. "Reverend Crane?" The visitor asked softly. "My name is Michael Graver." Thomas's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Graver? Yes." The young man smiled faintly. "My father was Elias. You knew him, I believe." "I buried him," Thomas whispered. Michael nodded, as if that were the expected answer. "Then I've come to thank you, and to tell you that his work will continue. Death isn't the end, Reverend. It's merely a pause between breaths." A chill crawled up Thomas's spine. "Whatever your father taught you, forget it. He dealt in abomination, not resurrection." The young man tilted his head. "Funny thing about abominations. They tend to outlive their judges." He smiled wider, the expression eerily calm. "You'll see soon enough." He turned and walked away, leaving Thomas trembling in the doorway, the scent of damp soil lingering behind him. 3 nights later, the church bell tolled at an hour when no one should have been awake. Parishioners found Reverend Crane dead in his study, hands folded neatly over a closed Bible. No wounds, no struggle, his face serene, almost smiling. The funeral was swift and discreet. The coffin sealed shut by order of the new Undertaker. Few questioned it. They were too tired of war, too used to death. As the mourners drifted away, a fresh sign appeared on the old funeral home: Graver and Son Restorative Services. That night, beneath a rising moon, someone placed a single white flower on the grave of Elias Graver. Its petals trembled in the wind, though no hand remained nearby. From somewhere beyond the fog, faint and deliberate, came the echo of a shovel biting into earth. Steady, practiced, and patient, Ashmoor had begun to breathe again.